My name is Claire Nguyen. I'm 32, a startup founder based in San Francisco, and for most of my adult life, I've been the family disappointment. Not the black sheep exactly, just the one who never quite fit the mold my family had pre-approved for what success should look like. I was supposed to finish my MBA at Wharton, join a consulting firm, and marry someone with a clean LinkedIn headshot. Instead, I dropped out halfway through, used the rest of my student loan money to build a mental health platform, and moved into a friend's guest room in Oakland while I coded at night and poured espresso shots at a local cafe during the day. It wasn't a dramatic rebellion, more like a slow, steady walk away from the version of me they had planned since I was 10. Every Thanksgiving, the roles were clear. My brother, Jake, the vice president of a private equity firm, would glide in with a firm handshake and a perfectly tailored coat, fresh off another deal, another title, another rental in Aspen. My parents would beam like he was a walking investment portfolio. Meanwhile, I'd get the same polite questions, barely disguised pity, and the inevitable chuckle from my uncle as he asked if I was still playing entrepreneur or if I'd finally found a job with dental. One year, I walked into the kitchen holding a cold brew I brought from the cafe where I worked. My cousin glanced up and laughed. "Oh, look, it's our barista with a laptop." Everyone laughed. I didn't. I just smiled like I was in on the joke, even though it didn't feel like a joke at all. My brother never said anything cruel outright, but his silence said plenty. He never asked what I was working on, never offered advice or introductions. He just assumed I'd outgrow whatever phase I was in and come back to the real world. There was this unspoken belief that I was drifting, wasting potential, while he was the one building something solid. They didn't say it, but I knew what they thought Jake builds Claire dreams. At dinner, they'd pass dishes and data in the same breath. Jake's firm just closed a $200 million acquisition. My dad would nod like it was gospel. My mom would mention how Jake's apartment was featured in some interior design magazine. Then they'd glance over at me waiting for my update. I'd say something vague, like working on a new prototype or testing user feedback, and they'd all nod politely, as if I'd said I was finger painting for a living. I used to try harder. I'd bring mock-ups, pitch decks, and once, even a user growth chart printed and laminated like some sad science fair project. But nothing ever landed. I wasn't building something they could understand or measure by their metrics. No offices, no staff, no business cards, just code sweat and a conviction I couldn't prove yet. Eventually, I stopped bringing anything. What hurt the most wasn't their doubt. It was the complete lack of curiosity. They never asked why I believed so much in what I was building. They never asked what made me stay up night after night, fixing bugs onboarding therapists and fielding crisis messages from users in distress. They didn't know my platform had helped a nurse in Ohio avoid burnout or that one review had called it life-saving. They just saw a daughter who once had potential and now served coffee in a hoodie. I don't blame them entirely. Their world was suits, titles, stock options, and articles in Forbes. Mine were error logs, grant proposals, and praying Stripe wouldn't freeze my account again. I just wish they'd looked a little deeper. The last time I attended Thanksgiving before it all changed, my brother raised a toast to growth, then winked at me. Here's to figuring it out one day. I raised my glass and smiled. But inside, something hardened. Not anger, exactly. Just resolve. Because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't lost. I was building. Quietly. Relentlessly. And one day, I would stop being their barista with a laptop. One day, they would know exactly who I was. When I left Wharton, I didn't have a plan B. I had an unfinished thesis, a half-broken laptop, and a sketchpad full of ideas that made more sense to me than anything in a classroom. I crashed on a friend's couch in Oakland, thinking it would be temporary, just until I got my MVP out and found funding. Temporary turned into 14 months. I rotated between friends' guest rooms sublets and once a co-working space that stayed open late enough to double as shelter. I sold my DSLR, canceled my health insurance, and started picking up more shifts at the cafe. At one point, I was pitching seed investors between espresso orders, pretending the loud steam from the milk frother wasn't swallowing my confidence. The platform I was building wasn't flashy. It wasn't built for the hype cycle or some dramatic billion-dollar exit. It was called MindNest, and the idea was simple: give frontline employees access to affordable AI-powered mental health tools when and where they needed them. No wait lists, no cold hotlines, no HR paperwork, just help. Quiet, immediate, and personal. It started with a chatbot trained on therapy-adjacent scripts. Then I partnered with a few behavioral science grad students to build out more responsive dynamic pathways. Eventually, we integrated with an API from a nonprofit that helped flag suicide ideation based on language cues. We weren't curing anything, but we were catching people before they fell. That mattered. No one in my family ever asked what I was building. They just saw the struggle. To them, I was wasting my potential. Jake, meanwhile, had just made Forbes 30 Under 30. He was traveling to New York every other week, closing rounds, sipping bourbon in high-rises. My parents framed the magazine cover and hung it next to his Harvard diploma in the hallway. I once joked about printing my first PayPal payout and pinning it up next to his. No one laughed. There was this look my dad would give me at dinner, like he was trying to figure out where he went wrong. My mom tried to help in her own way. She once sent me a spreadsheet of career pivots for creatives with a gentle note that said, "Maybe it's time." I thanked her and cried in the bathroom for half an hour. They didn't understand I wasn't just chasing an idea. I was building something I wished had existed when I was struggling alone during college, when therapy felt unreachable and everything felt like too much. I remember my first pilot program. A small health clinic in Denver agreed to try MindNest for their night shift nurses. We had 30 active users the first week. By week 3, we were getting over 100 check-ins a day. One nurse sent a message that just said, "I finally feel seen." I reread that sentence 100 times the night it came in. It was the first time I felt like maybe this wasn't a mistake, but I couldn't show that to my family. Jake was managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions. I was celebrating a user retention rate and a thank you note from someone I'd never met. At family dinners, they'd talk about stock options and how Jake was advising a startup on their acquisition strategy. I was still hoping Stripe wouldn't freeze our payouts over a missing tax ID. There was a part of me that wanted to scream, not because I needed them to be proud, but because I wanted them to understand. I wanted someone at that table to look at me and see more than a dropout with a passion project. I wanted someone to ask how I was funding this, how I handled user data, how I designed the triage protocol. No one did. I was never the kind of person who needed approval. But when you're building in silence for that long, a little recognition from the people who raised you would have meant everything. Instead, all I got was silence, or worse, concern disguised as advice. Maybe it's time to apply to grad school again. Maybe tech isn't stable. Maybe it's just not meant to be. I nodded every time, smiled, ate my mashed potatoes, then went home, stared at my error logs, and kept building. Not because I wanted to prove them wrong, but because I knew I was right. Jake once said at a holiday brunch that I was brave for taking time to find myself. He meant it as a compliment. I smiled, but inside I laughed. I wasn't finding myself. I was fighting for something bigger than any of them could see. And one day I knew they'd finally see it too. I was sitting in the corner booth of a noisy coffee shop in Soma when my phone rang. The screen showed an unknown number with a New York area code. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was calm, polished, and all business. He introduced himself as Jake Miller, managing partner at Ashcroft Capital. He said he'd come across our recent pilot with St. Vincent Medical and was impressed by the early results. At first, I thought it was a prank. Ashcroft didn't exactly take cold calls from seed-stage startups, but he kept talking, referencing specific data points from our partner report, citing our 62% re-engagement rate like he'd actually read the entire slide deck. Then he said something that made my stomach twist. He wanted to schedule a pitch call. Ashcroft was scouting early for their next health tech investment, and MindNest was on their radar. I didn't say anything at first. The name Jake Miller echoed in my head like a drum, my brother's name. But this voice was sharper, older maybe. Still, something in the cadence stopped me cold. He repeated his name again, slower this time. And then it clicked. It wasn't just a name. It was him. I didn't interrupt. I let him finish his perfectly rehearsed summary, his efficient scheduling request, his courteous goodbye. I said thank you, confirmed a time for the following week, and hung up. Then I just stared at the screen. My hands felt cold. My throat was tight. I ran through the possibilities. Maybe it was a different Jake Miller, but the odds were slim. The firm matched, the tone matched, and the fact that he clearly had no idea who he was talking to, that sealed it. He didn't recognize my voice. To him, I was just another founder with a decent pitch and a promising proof of concept. He didn't know he was about to invest in the very person he'd once told to get a real job. The irony was thick, almost cinematic. For a second, I considered canceling. Maybe it was too weird, too personal. But then I remembered every Thanksgiving. Every time I had smiled through his speeches, nodded, while he explained how the world worked like I was just visiting it. I thought about the times he didn't ask, didn't care, didn't see. And I realized I didn't owe him a warning. Let the meeting happen. Let the deck do the talking. If he was going to see MindNest for the first time, he might as well see it as the room did. Not as his sister's side project, but as a serious contender. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. For the first time, he would see what I had built, and he'd have to reckon with it. Not in a living room, not at a family dinner, but in a boardroom, where titles mattered, where ideas had weight. Being underestimated was a competitive edge, and this time, I had it. The driveway hadn't changed. Same cracked concrete, same leaning basketball hoop. No one had fixed in years. I parked farther down this time, half by choice, half, because Jake's Tesla was already in the usual spot. I stood at the door for a second before ringing. Through the frosted glass, I could see shadows moving, the hum of chatter, and that familiar sound of silverware clinking. My mother opened the door with a smile too quick, like it had been rehearsed. She pulled me into a half hug that ended before it really started. "You made it," she said, then turned back toward the kitchen. The hallway still smelled like cinnamon and floor polish. The photos hadn't changed either. Jake's graduation, his wedding, and his feature in that finance magazine. Nothing of mine. My dad looked up from the carving board, nodded once, then went back to slicing turkey. Jake greeted me like a colleague, not a sibling. He held his wine glass in one hand and gave me a pat on the back that felt more like a tap. "It's been a while," he said already, turning toward the living room. I sat at the end of the table, not because I had to, but because there wasn't really a place set for me anywhere else. My name wasn't on any card, but then again, no one's was. Yet somehow, everyone still had a spot that felt like theirs. Except me. Dinner started the way it always did. Toasts to health, to family, to another promotion Jake had just received. My mom beamed as she told the story of his latest deal, how his company had been approached by someone from the Department of Health for a consulting role. I chewed, slowly nodded, where expected, and let the conversation float past me like steam from the mashed potatoes. No one asked what I was working on. Instead, my uncle made a joke about tech founders eating ramen and sleeping in closets. My aunt asked if I was still freelancing. I smiled and said something vague about remote projects, which they accepted, without interest. Then Jake looked over and said, "Maybe this is the year you finally settle into something more stable." I met his gaze for a second longer than usual, then looked away. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to defend or explain or outline traction metrics and user growth. Tomorrow would do that for me. The rest of dinner passed in that same muted rhythm. Laughter that didn't include me, Updates I hadn't asked for, advice I didn't need. I helped clear the plates, stacked the dishes, and took the trash out without being asked. No one noticed. Later, I stood in my old bedroom, the walls still painted pale green. The bookshelf still held my SAT prep books and high school trophies. It was a museum of a girl they once believed in, but that girl had long since grown up. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling fan, listening to the muffled voices downstairs. They were still celebrating the version of success they understood, but I had learned to stop trying to fit their frame. Tomorrow, they'd meet someone new, someone they thought they knew but never really saw. And I wouldn't have to say a single word. I arrived 15 minutes early like I always did. The building was sleek, glass-fronted, and humming with the kind of quiet confidence only old money could buy. Ashcroft Capital's logo gleamed behind the front desk, etched in brushed steel. The receptionist didn't blink when I gave my name. She handed me a visitor's badge and pointed me toward the elevator. Top floor. Boardroom 3. I took the ride alone, adjusting my blazer, double-checking my notes. I had done this pitch before, but this one wasn't just business. It was personal. The boardroom was already half full when I stepped in. Investors analysts and 2 associates I recognized from our email thread. A few heads turned. One man did a double take. I watched Jake walk in 3 minutes later, phone in hand, mid-sentence. He looked up, saw me, and stopped walking. For a beat, the room felt like it had no air. He blinked confused, then took in the badge clipped to my blazer and the logo on my slides. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I didn't give him time to process it. "Good morning," I said, stepping to the front. "I'm Claire Nguyen, co-founder and CEO of MindNest. Thank you for taking the time to meet." I clicked on the first slide. The numbers filled the screen crisp and clean. Engagement rates, retention curves, and early outcome data from our pilot with St. Vincent. I walked them through our onboarding funnel, clinical integration roadmap, and user privacy safeguards. The room started to shift. The skeptical postures softened. People leaned in. Hands scribbled notes. A woman from operations raised her hand to ask about our natural language engine. I answered without pause, then tied it back to our projected cost savings for hospital clients. No one interrupted, not even Jake. When the deck ended, I clicked the remote and stepped back. Questions came fast. Product market fit. Scaling constraints. Liability. I answered everyone, not rushed, not rattled. Jake stayed quiet through most of it, watching like he'd never seen me before. Finally, one of the senior partners looked over. "Jake, any thoughts?" He sat up a little straighter. His voice was measured, but not cold. He talked about our traction, how rare it was to see this kind of clarity so early. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "I think we should lead the round." Silence followed, then nods. Agreements. The meeting moved to the next steps: diligence, timelines, term sheets. I kept my expression neutral. Inside, something shifted. Not satisfaction exactly, just a quiet acknowledgement that I had arrived. After the room cleared, I stayed back to pack up. Jake lingered by the window. He waited until we were alone, then turned to me slowly. "That was impressive," he said. Not surprised in a condescending way. Surprised like someone who'd missed the whole story. I didn't say anything at first, just zipped my laptop bag and looked at him. He scratched the back of his neck. "I didn't know you were building something like this." I nodded. "You never asked." He laughed, not unkindly. "I guess I didn't think I needed to. You always seemed like you were figuring it out." "I was," I said. "And now I have." He paused, watching me. "This thing you've built, it's real. It's good. Better than a lot of the things I see every day." I appreciated the words more than I expected. I didn't need them, but they landed anyway. "You pitched clean, controlled. Knew your numbers better than half the people we funded." I looked at him. "I wasn't trying to impress you." "I know," he said. "That's probably why you did." We stood there for a moment longer, not as rivals, not even as siblings, but as two people who had finally seen each other clearly. He extended his hand, not a hug, not some overcompensated gesture, just a professional handshake. I took it. "I'll see you at the partners' call next week," he said. "You're going to be busy." I smiled. "I already am." As I walked out of that building, the sun warming the back of my neck, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady, seen, not just by him, by the room, by the moment. For the first time, I wasn't someone's little sister chasing relevance. I was exactly where I belonged. And everyone knew it. 6 weeks later, I hosted a small dinner at my apartment. Nothing fancy. Just a quiet evening with too much food and not enough chairs. My parents came early holding a store-bought pie and a bag of groceries, and they insisted on bringing even though I said I had everything. Jake showed up last, a bottle of wine tucked under his arm, and a nervous energy he couldn't quite mask. It wasn't the expensive kind he used to bring to family dinners. This one had a handwritten label from a local vineyard and looked like something chosen with thought. He handed it to me without comment. I nodded and took it to the kitchen. The night was easy in a way it had never been before. No sideways questions. No commentary dressed as concern. Just laughter clinking silverware and talk that didn't revolve around quarterly bonuses or Ivy League connections. At one point, my father wandered to the bookshelf near the hallway. He paused in front of the framed article from Health Tech Quarterly. My name was in the headline. The photo showed me standing with our hospital partner in the Ashcroft team. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at it for a long moment, like it had caught him off guard. I joined him standing a few feet away. He finally spoke, voice lower than usual. "You know, I didn't really understand what you were doing, not until recently." I waited. He looked at the photo again. "But now I see what it is. You built something real, something that matters." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it didn't need to be. It was quiet recognition, and that made it feel more honest. I smiled and thanked him. He nodded once, then turned back toward the table. Later that evening, after dishes were washed and leftovers packed, Jake pulled me aside near the balcony. He said he'd been thinking a lot about that meeting, about how he'd misjudged what I was building, about how sometimes we get so caught up in our own frameworks that we miss what's right in front of us. I listened, then told him the truth. I didn't build mindness to prove anything to anyone. I built it because I believed it needed to exist. For people like me. For people who don't always know how to ask for help, but need it anyway. He didn't say much after that, just nodded like he finally understood what it meant to see someone as they are not as you expect them to be. As I closed the door behind them that night, I felt something shift. Not in them, in me. I wasn't carrying the weight anymore. Not of their doubt. Not of their expectations. I had already let it go. The truth is, I thought I needed their approval to feel enough, but what I needed was to stop waiting for it. Because the most powerful kind of validation isn't given. It's realized. And I had finally reached that place on my own.